All right, so this is our last session of the conference and of the day. I believe after this there will be some birds of a feather, but this is it as far as presentations. What we have next is Permission Mining and GCP by Colin of Netskope. So over to you, Colin.
Great, thank you for having me at Forward Cloud Sec. My name's Colin Estep. I work for Netskope Threat Labs, where we do all kinds of cloud security research. So I'm going to be talking about permission mining in the Google Cloud Platform. So first, I'm going to go over a problem I call IAM exposure, and then we'll dive into IAM and GCP specifically. And then I want to talk about a potential privilege escalation example that we found in a production environment. And then we'll talk about tools for auditing problems like this and some remediation steps. So first, what do I mean by IAM exposure? Well, it's kind of similar in a way to data exposure in the cloud. I think we've all seen these headlines in the news about S3 buckets being exposed and sensitive data leaving the organization. And so everybody's concerned about the attack surface there and making mistakes in configuring our security around those buckets. Well, I feel like there's not as much talk about IAM exposure, where we're looking at the risk from our actual identities in our environment. So I feel like this stems from answering some basic questions like, what can all of your users do? And then based on the capabilities that your users have, asking questions like, could one of these users, if they were compromised, result in administrator access across my environment? Unfortunately, I feel like a lot of organizations today can't really answer those questions very easily. And so we may be wondering, why is that? Why is IAM challenging to sort of get a handle on? And I think that there's kind of three components. One is these are really dynamic environments where you want to get projects off the ground in a hurry. So you may be rushed to provision permissions in order to reduce the friction there. And even if you're aware of sort of over provisioning the permissions, you may think, well, I'll get back to it later and figure out least privilege when we have the moment to do that. And that may never come. Secondly, I think auditing this kind of thing at scale is a problem. If you have thousands of users and then tens of thousands of identities, it could be tough to kind of keep that all scoped and understand where the risks are. And then lastly, what I think is the most pervasive is misunderstanding entitlements. So I borrowed this flow chart from Amazon, and as you can tell, it's not straightforward to always figure out under what conditions and with what permissions people can do certain things. So I feel like even if you do the work to try to establish least privileges, sometimes you can be wrong. So now that I've talked about that problem in general, let's dive into GCP itself and talk about IAM. So first of all, in GCP, they call identities members. So there's 4 different types of members. On the left side of the screen, we see users and groups. And these are basically the same as any other system where you would have users and groups. The difference here is that in GCP, you don't really create them in GCP itself. They get connected through G Suite or some identity provider that you're using. And then on the right side of the screen, we have service accounts and domains, and these are kind of special for GCP. So if you're familiar with AWS, service accounts are kind of like IAM roles or service principals in Azure. So these are mainly intended for programmatic use. So they're kind of like headless users. They don't always have an actual human behind them. And in GCP, they're considered to be not just an identity, but also a resource. And I'll talk more about that a little later. And then lastly, we have domains. And this is just like in G Suite, you would establish, for your company like Netskope.com, you can have a domain and you can give permissions to that domain. So if I want everybody in the company to be able to view something, I can grant that permission. So next, just a couple more terms I want to define before we dive into the problems. So in GCP, there's only allow and there's no real deny within IAM. So when you're establishing a permission, you're allowing a specific API call. So here in the white boxes, you see these individual permissions, but that's not how you assign things to users or groups. The way that you do this is with a collection of permissions called a role. So here we see a role in the gray box called compute instance admin, and that contains all these different permissions to be able to create, destroy, and stop, instances. Now, talking about roles being collections of permissions, there's 3 different types, and there's 2 that are maintained by Google: basic and predefined. Basic is not recommended for use by Google themselves. This sort of predates identity and access management in Google. And some examples of these basic roles are owner, editor, viewer. And these are not recommended because they have a lot of permissions associated with them. They're very permissive if you grant this to somebody. So they're probably not going to be least privilege in most cases. The predefined roles are also out of the box, maintained by Google. And these are more focused on certain roles. Like I showed the compute instance admin in the previous slide. There's load balancer admin and so forth. So these are a better starting point for least privileges if you're granting permissions. And then the last type is a custom role. And that's basically if you really know what permissions you want to grant, and there's not a role that sort of conforms to that, you can create your own, and that's custom to just your environment. So the main takeaway here is that basic roles are kind of a no-no. And then when you're assigning a role to a member, this is called a binding, and it's just basically pairing the role with the member. So here I'm showing an example of a service account that has Bigtable admin as its role. So it has a lot of permissions around Bigtable. And the policy is a collection of bindings. So this is the output of a IAM policy that I had in my environment at a project level. And so this is just basically an array of bindings here. So that's kind of how to think about that. And then sort of the last conceptual thing I want to go over about GCP is we have our roles and bindings, and the bindings make up a policy. Now, on the right side of this graphic, you'll see a hierarchy, and this is the hierarchy that's built into GCP by default. So at the top level, you have your organization, and then under that, you can have a folder. You don't have to have folders, that's optional, but you can have a folder or number of folders. And this is more like your OUs. So it would be like the marketing department or engineering department, or it could be based on geographies. But basically, this is another way to organize your organization. And then under folders, you have projects. And this is sort of similar to an AWS account. So this is where you would create resources. So any resource in GCP has to be in a project. And basically, why these are sort of paired together, where we have an IAM policy and then a hierarchy on the right side, is that you have IAM policies at every level of the hierarchy. So that means you can assign permissions at any level within GCP. The important thing to remember here is that there is inheritance. So if you assign a permission at that top of the hierarchy, it goes all the way down. And as you're creating projects and creating new resources, anything at a higher level will be inherited to that project or resource. So you really have to think about the isolation boundaries and the design of your environment before you start establishing these permissions. Okay, so now let's dive a little bit more into service accounts. Now, like I mentioned, they are a resource, so they need to be created within a project. So in this example, I have a bunch of service accounts I've created within one project. And I want to give one of my users the ability to enumerate and impersonate a service account. So what I do is I actually create an IAM binding that says that this user can act as this service account, and I bind it right at the service account as a resource. Now, what this means is that that user cannot enumerate or impersonate any of the other service accounts in my project. However, if I do the same thing and just do the binding at the project level, now this guy can see and act as any service account in this project. And that means additional service accounts that are created in the future will also inherit that binding. And now this user has all these different accounts that he can act as in the environment. So as you might think, this kind of setup can produce a lot of issues as far as trying to determine who can escalate privileges and where. So here's an example that we found in a real production environment with the tool that I wrote. And here I'm just showing we have GCP, and within GCP, we've created our organization, and then we have a project in the organization. So in the project, we're doing some common things. We have BigQuery there. We might have some Kubernetes clusters. We might have some virtual machines. And we want to create a service account. But this service account, for whatever reason, needed to have some visibility at the organization level. And it was granted owner permission at the organization level. So again, owner is a basic role. This means that if you look at it in the console of GCP, you can see that there's over 4,500 different API calls this thing can make. And even the description tells you this is full access to all resources. So this thing is like the root account at the organization level now. So next, we have a user that needs to be able to do some things in the project, and they need to go across different services like compute as well as BigQuery and other things. And so, they might be doing DevOps type stuff where they're destroying and creating resources and doing all kinds of things. So we decided to grant him editor permissions at the project level. And editor is another basic role. Again, this thing has over 4,200 permissions. It can edit all the resources. So it's kind of permissive. So now the setup is we've got this user with editor permissions on the project, and we may not have granted permissions outside of this project at all to that user. So we think, oh, it's fine. He's contained in that project. That's okay. But we didn't realize that service account has permissions at the organization level. So now this guy essentially has the capability to escalate his privileges very easily up to a full admin over the entire organization. Now, I sort of replicated this in one of my test environments, and here I have a service account that I created that has this sort of owner permissions. And the thing here that I wanted to show is that it's kind of difficult to manage these things because by design, Google doesn't reveal to you what permissions this service account has. So even as the owner of this service account, I don't know what it can do because someone else may have given me permissions in their area that I can't see. So when I'm looking at this in the console, on the right-hand side, I can see all these permissions that are inherited down to this resource, to the service account as a resource. But as an identity, I don't know what this service account can do by looking at it. And the same goes for the output from, looking at it via API, just listing them. So how do you deal with this? Well, there are some tools for auditing. Since I started looking at this problem and created a tool, GCP actually came out with a tool as well called IAM Analyzer. And so this is something that can help you find what identities can do in the environment. But you have to know what you're looking for. So an example here is I want to start at the organization level, and I want to find any identity that has a binding with these permissions contained in it. So I give it a list of permissions and let it go, and it gives me some output. And so this is very useful. I can see the individual permission that I found, and I can see the corresponding role name at the bottom there. And then I can also see the identities associated with this. So in my case, I have X, Y, and Z in my test environment that have these sort of permissions. And then it tells me this is the resource that they have that permission on. But again, since my resource is a service account, how do I know that this is a risk? I can't tell that from this output. Now, in the tool that I had written to sort of help us deal with this, we take a little different tact. And unfortunately, I don't have enough time to go through the ins and outs of the tool itself. But just to give you an idea of what it's doing, it goes member by member and lists out some things. And so here I'm just listing out the output for a member named X. And it tells you, is this an external member? Meaning, is it like something at gmail.com, or is it within my corporate environment? And here it's saying, no, it's not an external member. Yes, it does have service account access. Yes, it does have some way to get to the admin level of access in the environment. And then it goes through and it lists the direct bindings and the indirect bindings. So here I'm showing direct bindings on all different levels of the hierarchy assigned to this identity. And then at the bottom, we have the indirect bindings. So these are bindings that they can essentially get to via acting as a service account. So these are the indirect entitlements for this particular user. So if the user didn't have admin privileges directly assigned to it, it would tell me, oh, wow, this thing has owner role at the organization level. So this is a possible privilege escalation for this user. Okay, so let's say that we are able to audit this and continually monitor it and get these alerts that we have some privilege escalation paths that we need to be concerned with. How do we remediate it? Well, there's some basic steps, especially in this particular situation. So you can, number one, bring down the service account bindings down the hierarchy. So instead of making it an owner at the organization level, maybe you can make it at the folder level or project level or resource level. Also, you should probably change out the basic roles for more granular roles. Or lastly, there's maybe some bindings that are legacy bindings that aren't needed anymore, and you can remove those altogether. And that's actually what happened in the example that we found in the production environment. They said, oh, you know what, this service account doesn't really need owner level permissions or to be at the organization level. So we're going to remove those altogether. And so the idea here is, using a tool like this to proactively reduce the risk in the environment without waiting for a compromise. So that's about it for my time. I wanted to leave a couple minutes for questions. So here's the link for feedback on my talk. Thank you so much for having me. I've got my Twitter handle here, LinkedIn. If you guys want to connect, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin. Are there any questions from the audience? Oh, we have one question here.
Hi. So one of the things that I do in my organization to kind of hide what permissions individuals have is I add them to groups in G Suite and then assign permissions to those groups. So I'm pretty sure that there's no way to do that with service accounts, right? Because you can't access them in G Suite. So do you have any recommendations for a similar technique for obscuring what permissions certain service accounts have? Thanks.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, the groups are maintained separately, and so you can't really make service accounts part of a group. Yeah, that's a great question. Like, how do we maintain that? I'm not aware of any way to make sort of a template that you could apply across the board for certain service accounts. So yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had a good answer off the top of my head, but unfortunately I don't have one.
One more question.
So another thing that I do is I create custom roles for each service, so like compute, App Engine. In your experience, do you create per service, or do you just create one fat role for like the devs and then one for QA or whatever other team? Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, I've done it by service more. But I guess you could do it for, devs versus QA, where you're creating a custom role and you know that they want to do certain things all the time. I could see wanting to do that as well.
I'm curious what your maintenance looks like as new services are added. What does that look like for you?
So one of the things that when there's a new service, I'll just create a new role for that. Or you mean a service account or like a Google service? I'll just create a new custom role for that service, and then take out like delete permissions and get IAM and set IAM permissions.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Colin? Thank you so much, Colin. I know this is an area where there's not a lot of information out there, so appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, yes.